Imagine waking up one day to realize you've been invisible in the most important life of all your own. He hadn't spoken in weeks. Not a word, not a whisper, just the hum of machines and the steady rise and fall of his son's chest. David Hale had built billion-dollar apps, advised presidents, but now, sitting in a hospital room with his 10-year-old son in a coma, he couldn't even say, "I'm sorry." His world had crashed in one brutal second on a rainy highway, and now silence was the only thing that answered him. Then she walked in. A barefoot teenager with a battered astronomy book and no papers to prove she existed. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't family. She barely spoke above a whisper. But the moment Luna Morales sat down beside Caleb and began to read about stars, Orion, Andromeda, the dying light of distant galaxies, something shifted. David felt it. The room felt different. The silence began to bend, and when Caleb's eyelids fluttered weeks later and his voice croaked out a single word, Light David knew it wasn't science that brought his son back. It was presence. It was her. It was a girl between worlds. David Hale sat beside the hospital bed, motionless as if any sudden breath might tear the fabric of what little was left. The room was sterile, lit by soft fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out, lifeless. His son, Caleb, just 10 years old, lay unconscious, his small chest rising and falling beneath the pale blue blanket kept alive by tubes, wires, and a machine that hummed with mechanical patience. There were no visitors, no flowers, no balloons. Just the quiet drip of IV fluid and the haunting rhythm of the heart monitor that seemed to mock the man who once had everything. David had built his life with Precision Tech Company, sold by 30 Forbes list, by 32 keynote speaker global consultant, the man who made things happen. But none of that mattered now. None of that could wake Caleb. He had fired engineers and negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, but now he couldn't lift his eyes to meet the stillness in his son's face. He hadn't left that room in days. Coffee went cold in his hands. His phone, once an extension of his body, lay in a drawer untouched. The world could burn, and he wouldn't care. He had failed where it mattered most, being present. The guilt wrapped around his spine like cold iron. There had been arguments, missed dinners, moments brushed aside for meetings, emails, flights. "We'll play later," he had promised Caleb too many times. "Daddy's working." Now the boy who had once begged for bedtime stories and space adventures lay silent, unreachable. David had no stories left, no answers, just silence. It was not the silence of peace, but of absence of consequences finally arriving. He sat there still in his pressed shirt and expensive watch, and for the first time in his life, David Hale realized that none of it could save him. Not from this. Not from the unbearable weight of waiting beside a child you can't bring back. It happened in less than 5 seconds. A flash of headlights, the scream of metal, the sudden brutal stillness that follows catastrophe. Caleb was in the back seat singing softly to himself some silly space song he'd made up about Jupiter's rings. David remembered glancing at him in the rearview mirror just moments before smiling at the way his son's imagination never stopped. Then the truck swerved. There was no warning, no time to brake. The SUV slammed into them at an intersection David had driven through 1,000 times. Routine became ruin in an instant. Glass exploded, metal twisted, the world spun. When David opened his eyes, there was smoke, blood, and silence. Caleb didn't move. That image, his son's small body slumped sideways, seatbelt barely holding him upright, was now etched into his brain like a brand. The paramedics said it was a miracle he survived the initial impact. But the miracle came with a price, a traumatic brain injury, deep and unpredictable. He may wake up tomorrow, or never, they said, their faces clinical, but not unkind. David had sat there covered in his son's blood, nodding, trying to process those impossible words. The guilt set in immediately. Why had he taken that route? Why hadn't he seen the truck coming? Why didn't he just stay home that day? Caleb had wanted pancakes. They were on their way to brunch. Something so ordinary had turned catastrophic. There was no one to blame, and yet David blamed himself entirely. Every beep of the machines, every sterile hallway, every pause in the monitor's rhythm was a cruel reminder that one moment of inattention, 1 second of bad luck had fractured a 10-year-old boy's life, and with it, his father's. David would have given anything, everything to trade places. But time doesn't bargain. It only waits. And so did he. After the accident, David Hale vanished, not in the literal sense, but in all the ways that mattered. He resigned from the company he'd spent a decade building without fanfare, without a press release. The board called investors panicked, but he let the world unravel behind him like smoke. He stopped answering emails, ignored messages from colleagues and friends, and let the phone ring until the battery died and stayed dead. His penthouse sat empty, the sheets unwashed, the lights off. Clothes hung in the closet untouched, frozen in time like the life he no longer lived. David didn't return to his old gym. He no longer drank his signature morning coffee. He didn't read the tech journals or news alerts he once consumed with religious devotion. His once sharp suits hung loose on his thinning frame. The man who once filled conference rooms with decisive words now spoke to no one, not even himself. Days passed in silence. He forgot what his own voice sounded like. When nurses asked if he needed anything, he only nodded or shook his head, afraid that speaking might shatter the fragile shell he now wore. He moved like a ghost haunting the corners of the hospital, his presence heavy unspeaking. He no longer existed as David Hale, visionary entrepreneur and public intellectual. He was just the father in room 314, the man who never left. In his mind, he had forfeited the right to speak, to lead to hope. The voice that once shaped deals and dazzled stages had gone quiet, as if words themselves were now meaningless. Because what was the point of speech if the only person he wanted to talk to, the only person he needed to hear from, lay still silent somewhere deep beneath machines and blinking lights? So David gave up the noise of the world, retreating into a private silence as penance, a silence as endless as the void inside him. David Hale moved through the hospital like a shadow there, but not quite present, alive, but no longer living. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the shift changes of nurses and the soft, rhythmic beeping of machines that echoed in his skull like a cruel clock. He ate only when reminded, slept only when his body collapsed from exhaustion. But even then, he never truly rested. His dreams, when they came, were fragmented flashes of Caleb's laughter, the bounce of a soccer ball across their old driveway, the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings. And then always the crash, the silence, the image of his son's motionless form. He floated through these days untethered, a man caught between two realities, the world of the living, loud and bustling just outside the hospital doors, and the world of waiting, suspended in sterile stillness where pain hummed beneath the surface like static. He didn't belong to either. The staff grew used to his presence, the man with hollow eyes always in the same chair, speaking only in nods and broken whispers. They pitied him, perhaps. But David didn't want pity. He didn't want anything but time reversed. He walked the corridors like a phantom, his footsteps unheard, his pain unseen. When families around him celebrated small miracles, an eyelid twitch, a finger squeeze, he said nothing, only watched with quiet envy and aching grief. He was not praying anymore, not hoping, just existing, breathing because biology demanded it, not because he chose to. The life he had before the accident, his success, his identity, even his name meant nothing now. He had become a man hollowed out by grief, floating between what was and what could have been, anchored only by the steady, unconscious breaths of the boy he could not reach. He was no longer David Hale. He was the echo of a father waiting in the in-between. Luna Morales had mastered the art of disappearing without ever leaving. At 17, she moved through the world with the practiced silence of someone who had long since learned that being invisible was often safer than being seen. She sat in the back of every classroom, never raised her hand, and made no friends, not because she lacked intelligence or kindness, but because she understood too well what it meant to live in the margins. Her skin was the color of warm earth, her dark hair always pulled back with a rubber band she'd used for months, and her shoes, always a size too small, told stories her voice never dared to. Luna didn't complain. She didn't draw attention. She walked quickly, kept her head down, and memorized every hallway, every exit, every shortcut, like it was survival, because for her it was. She had no official records, no birth certificate in the system, no social security number. As far as the government was concerned, Luna Morales didn't exist. She was a ghost in plain sight, the daughter of undocumented parents who had crossed borders with hope and desperation stitched into their bones. Luna watched as other girls her age giggled over phone screens and posted dances online. She watched but never joined. Her phone was a flip model prepaid in cash. Her internet came in stolen moments outside the library. She carried herself like someone older, someone who'd seen things and swallowed them whole without crying out. Teachers rarely remembered her name. Classmates barely noticed her presence, and strangers never looked twice. But Luna wasn't weak. Behind those quiet eyes lived galaxies, books she read under the covers at night, constellations she memorized from torn encyclopedias, entire solar systems imagined in silence. She wasn't loud, but she was brilliant. She wasn't seen, but she was deeply aware. And though the world passed her by like wind across glass, Luna Morales absorbed everything. Because sometimes the quietest ones are the ones listening most. Luna Morales had spent her entire life balancing on the edge of a border that followed her everywhere, not just between countries, but between being and not being, between presence and erasure. Born in a dusty village her mother never spoke about, without tears in her eyes. Luna crossed into the United States in the arms of a frightened teenage woman who carried nothing but a baby, a rosary, and the name of a cousin scrawled on a wrinkled paper. They never went back. They never could. From the moment Luna could walk, she was taught to be cautious, quiet, careful. "Never tell anyone where we're from," her mother whispered. "Never say too much. Never trust the system." Paperwork was a dream they couldn't afford. There was no green card tucked away for safety, no visa to renew, no number to fill out on school forms. Every field that asked for legal status was a minefield. Her enrollment in school had been a miracle granted by a kind administrator who looked the other way, and even that felt fragile. Luna lived with the constant weight of illegitimacy, not in who she was as a person, but in how the world perceived her. In the eyes of the system, she was uncounted. No protection, no rights, no future she could plan with certainty. Every day brought a new risk, a knock on the door, a wrong turn near a checkpoint, a careless name drop that might undo everything. Her mother worked long hours cleaning motel rooms under a fake name, while Luna kept her head down and her grades high, praying that maybe someone would see her as more than a liability. But mostly she hoped not to be seen at all, because being seen meant being found. And being found in her world didn't end with help, it ended in disappearance. Luna didn't fear the dark, she feared the spotlight. It started as a quiet favor and opportunity whispered to Luna by her English teacher, Mrs. Patel, who saw the way she melted into the back of the room, yet turned in essays that read like poetry stitched with science. "There's a volunteer program at St. Mary's Hospital," she'd said gently after class one day. "They need someone to read to patients who can't respond. Just a voice, just a presence. I thought of you." Luna didn't ask questions. She didn't dare. Opportunities didn't knock twice for people like her, and this one came without forms, background checks, or fingerprints. The hospital didn't care where she came from, only that she showed up. And so, 3 days later, she stood at the nurse's station with a tote bag full of worn library books, unsure of where to go or what to say. The nurse looked over the rim of her glasses and waved her toward the long hallway of the pediatric ward. "Room 314. Boy's been under for weeks. No visitors. You'll be good company," she said, already turning away. Luna followed the sterile tiles with quiet steps, passing open doors and machines that beeped like metronomes counting the breaths of children who couldn't speak for themselves. When she reached the room, she hesitated. The boy, small, pale still, was swallowed by a too-big bed and a halo of tubes. For a moment, Luna felt out of place, unsure what right she had to be there. But then she saw the stack of untouched books on the shelf, and something softened. She chose the one on top, The Universe and You, and began to read. Her voice barely rose above the hum of machines, but she kept going. She didn't know if the boy could hear her. She only knew what silence felt like and how much it could hurt. So she read Not because someone was listening, but because someone should. No one noticed her when she entered the room, and no one asked when she stayed. Luna Morales, with her quiet eyes and second-hand shoes, slipped in and out of Caleb's hospital room like a breeze, gentle, invisible, essential only to those who could feel her. The nurses nodded vaguely when she passed, assuming she was someone's niece or a student volunteer from some program they didn't remember authorizing. Doctors glanced at her once or twice, said nothing, and moved on to patients who had voices, charts that changed families who demanded answers. Caleb had none of those, and Luna had nothing to prove, so she kept returning. Every afternoon after school, she would walk the 8 blocks to the hospital, sit beside the unconscious boy, and read from the same worn collection of astronomy books. She read about supernovas and dwarf stars, about galaxies colliding, about the silence between planets and the strange poetry of black holes. Her voice never rose above a murmur, but it filled the room in a way machines never could. She never spoke to Caleb like he was broken. She spoke like he was listening. And maybe, just maybe, he was. But the world didn't notice. Hospital volunteers came and went. Families cried and celebrated down the hall. The world of the hospital kept spinning, sterile and indifferent. Luna, seated beside a boy who hadn't moved in weeks, was just another shadow against the wall. She brought no flowers, no balloons, no photos, just words. Words and patience. And even though no one praised her or asked for her name, Luna didn't stop. Because somewhere deep in her she understood that the greatest kindnesses are often the ones no one sees. And sometimes being invisible is exactly what lets you reach what no one else can. Luna never came to the hospital empty-handed. Each day, tucked beneath her arm or buried in the folds of her oversized sweater, was a book. Not just any book, but one filled with stars. It was a worn collection of cosmic wonders, constellations traced across yellowed pages, myths tied to galaxies, diagrams of the solar system drawn with smudged ink. She had borrowed it from the public library so many times that the librarian eventually handed it to her with a knowing nod and stopped resetting the return date. Luna loved the stars not just for their beauty but for their permanence. Long after civilizations crumbled and names were forgotten, the stars remained burning in silence, distant and undemanding. So when she sat beside Caleb, who hadn't opened his eyes in weeks, it made sense to start there. She would read aloud about Orion's belt, about how the hunter chased the scorpion across the sky for eternity. She'd whisper the story of Cassiopeia cursed to hang upside down forever, and of Andromeda chained to a rock but saved by a winged hero. She read about nebulae and red giants, about time bending inside black holes, and the mystery of dark matter, the things we know are there, even when we cannot see them. Her voice was calm, never theatrical, as if she were telling secrets meant only for Caleb's ears. She chose these stories not just because they were fascinating, but because they mirrored something silent and vast within herself. There was something about the endlessness of space that made her feel less small. So she gave that gift to Caleb, not knowing if he could hear, not needing him to respond. Every word was a breadcrumb, a thread of light in the dark, a quiet reminder that even in the deepest silence, stars were still burning, stories were still being told, and maybe someone was listening. Luna read the way some people pray, with quiet reverence, unwavering patience, and a softness that carried more weight than volume ever could. She never rushed, never stumbled, never filled the silence with unnecessary words. Instead, she let the rhythm of each sentence unfold, like the slow bloom of a night flower, delicate and intentional. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she were speaking directly to Caleb's subconscious, bypassing the broken body and speaking straight to whatever part of him might still be listening deep inside. She didn't mind that there was no response, no flicker of recognition, no movement at all. That wasn't the point. The point was to be there, to keep showing up, to create a pattern of presence that Caleb could rely on, even if he couldn't acknowledge it. She read about distant galaxies and collapsing stars, about gravitational waves and planetary rings, and she paused when a passage felt particularly beautiful, not to explain it, but to let the silence breathe with her. Sometimes, between paragraphs, she would glance at Caleb, searching for the tiniest twitch or shift, but when there was none, she simply turned the page and continued unfazed. There was a steadiness in her routine, a quiet power in her refusal to give up. The hospital around her bustled with movement and urgency alarms, footsteps, voices barking orders, but Luna remained still. Her voice a calm tide washing over a room full of machines. She didn't try to be magical. She didn't need miracles. What she gave was much rarer time, consistency, and care that asked for nothing in return. In a world obsessed with results and noise, Luna's gift was her willingness to keep reading slowly, softly, and with unshakable hope, even if no one heard her but the stars. David didn't mean to listen at first. He was simply there as he always was, rooted to the chair in the corner of the hospital room, cloaked in silence and grief, watching machines blink as if they alone held the power to turn time back. But on the third day of her visit, as Luna's voice floated through the air, quiet and deliberate, something in him stirred, not a reaction he could name, but a shift subtle and undeniable. Her voice didn't command attention. It didn't demand to be heard. It simply existed, patient and persistent, like wind carving stone. David had heard thousands of voices in his life, pitches rising in boardrooms, speeches booming from stages, interviews echoing across studios, but none of them sounded like this. Luna read about the birth of stars and the death of light, about constellations that had guided sailors and stories that had survived centuries. He recognized some of the terms. He'd once been a science kid himself, but it wasn't the content that caught him. It was the cadence, the trust in the act of speaking, even when no one answered. He sat in the dark corner, motionless, his face half-shadowed, his breath shallow. He didn't want her to know he was listening, didn't want to interrupt the fragile, sacred rhythm she brought into the sterile room. But he listened, truly, listened for the first time in weeks, not just to her words, but to the way they filled the space, softened the walls, gave Caleb's stillness a kind of context. It occurred to David painfully and quietly that maybe this girl, this stranger, was doing what he could not. She was reaching his son not through logic, not through science or willpower, but through presence. And somehow, in listening to her, David began to hear parts of himself that had gone silent long before the accident. Something imperceptible began to shift in the room, so subtle that no one could have named the moment it started. It wasn't in the machines, they still hummed and beeped with indifferent precision, nor in Caleb, who lay as still as ever beneath his blanket. The change lived in the space between things, between Luna's breath and the next word she read, between the low murmur of her voice and the pulse of silence that followed. The room, once so clinical and cold, began to feel softer, warmer, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The fluorescent lights no longer felt harsh. The corners, once filled with shadows of fear and helplessness, now held something gentler, something almost sacred. Luna brought no candles, no prayers, no music, and yet the air shifted when she spoke. Even the nurses, busy with charts and rotations, began to slow their pace when walking past room 314 as if crossing some invisible threshold. David noticed it too. The tension in his shoulders lessened, though he never realized when. The ache in his chest didn't vanish, but it no longer drowned him. There was a rhythm now. Luna's arrival, her quiet greeting to Caleb, the turning of pages, the soft rise and fall of her storytelling. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't medical, and yet it was working on something deeper than flesh. The room had once felt like a waiting room for grief, suspended in hopelessness, but now it felt like something was taking root, like a seed planted in frozen soil, unsure if it would bloom, but daring to try. Luna didn't cast spells. She didn't change the machines, but somehow by simply being there, by reading with devotion and presence, she had altered the air itself. It was as if magic had visited the room in a form no one expected, quiet, steady, and wrapped in the voice of a girl who believed stars were still worth naming. Luna never asked many questions, and David never offered many answers. Their interactions were a delicate dance of silence and subtle understanding, a quiet exchange that filled the space where words might have overwhelmed or fallen short. She would come to the hospital room without expectation, carrying her books and a calm presence settling gently beside Caleb's bedside with no need for explanation or fanfare. David noticed, though he never said it aloud, how her quiet strength seemed to stitch together the ragged edges of the days that blurred into nights, how her unspoken empathy created a space where hope could breathe even if just a little. In her silence, Luna spoke volumes not with language, but with patience, with a steady gaze, with the gentle rhythm of her voice when she read. David, worn down by weeks of hospital routines and the heavy weight of grief, found himself strangely comforted by her presence, even if he kept his own feelings locked away behind a reserved exterior. They existed together in that room, like two shadows in a dimly lit space, neither intrusive, neither demanding, both simply present. He didn't ask her about her life, and she didn't pry into his. There was no need for probing questions or rehearsed answers. Instead, their connection grew through the quiet moments, the turning of pages, the soft murmurs about stars and galaxies, the occasional glance exchange that said without words, "You're not alone." In that space of mutual restraint, something fragile yet profound took root. A bond forged not by conversation, but by the shared understanding that sometimes healing begins in the absence of speech, in the simple act of being there, steadfast and silent, when words cannot reach. Each day, Luna and David existed together in a shared stillness that spoke louder than any conversation ever could. Their presence beside Caleb's hospital bed was a quiet ritual, unspoken, but deeply felt, a delicate balance of being without needing to fill the silence with words. The sterile hum of machines and the faint scent of antiseptic framed their daily vigil. But within that clinical space, something profoundly human unfolded, a silent communion of hope, grief, and resilience. Luna would arrive carrying her books, her footsteps soft, her gaze steady yet gentle as she settled into her seat beside Caleb. David, worn and withdrawn, would come with the weight of sleepless nights and endless worry etched into the lines of his face. Yet when he saw Luna's quiet determination, a small flicker of peace would stir within him. They shared no grand declarations, no elaborate plans, only the simple, steady act of showing up. Sometimes, Luna's soft voice would break the stillness as she read passages about distant stars, galaxies, and black holes, weaving stories that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the hospital room. David would listen, not always speaking, but absorbing, letting the cosmic tales pull his mind away from pain, if only for a moment. In those hours, the room shifted from a place of despair to a sanctuary of calm, where presence itself was a balm. Their companionship was unhurried and unforced. It needed no justification or explanation. They simply were two souls intertwined in a quiet, steady rhythm that neither wanted to disrupt. This unspoken partnership became a lifeline, a reminder that sometimes the deepest support comes not from words, but from enduring presence, the unwavering act of standing together through the silence and uncertainty. David's transformation was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to anyone watching. One afternoon, as Luna softly turned the pages of a worn astronomy book, her voice steady and calm, David found himself drawn into the rhythm of her reading. The words about stars, constellations, and black holes, once foreign and distant, began to resonate deep within him, offering a fragile thread of connection to a world beyond the sterile hospital walls. He hesitated then, almost on instinct, reached for the book, turning the pages alongside her, mimicking her gentle cadence. It wasn't about understanding every word or grasping the complex cosmic concepts. It was about learning how to be present without the burden of fixing, or explaining how to offer comfort without demanding responses. With each session, David's silence shifted from one of despair to one of attentiveness. He was no longer a ghost hovering on the edge of his son's life, but an active participant in the fragile dance of healing. He realized that presence wasn't about grand gestures or heroic efforts. It was the simple act of sitting quietly, sharing space, breathing in sync with Caleb's slow, uneven breaths. Words felt unnecessary sometimes, even intrusive, as if silence itself was the language that Caleb needed most. Luna's example guided him, her patience, her steady voice, her refusal to fill the void with noise, and David began to embody those qualities, drawing strength from the quiet. In the stillness, something profound took root, a new way to love, to wait, and to hope. He was learning not to escape from the pain, but to sit with it alongside his son, allowing healing to unfold, not on a schedule, but in its own time, measured not by words, but by the simple enduring gift of being there. In the quiet spaces between words and breaths, an unspoken bond began to weave itself steadily and gently around David, Luna, and Caleb. It was not forged through grand declarations or dramatic moments, but through countless small, silent intervals filled with presence and patience. Each day as Luna sat beside Caleb's hospital bed, her voice barely more than a whisper, and David lingered just beyond the edge. Their shared stillness became a sanctuary, a place where the weight of fear and uncertainty softened, if only for a moment. These pauses, where no one pressed for progress or explanations, held more meaning than any conversation could. David found himself drawn deeper into this silence, learning to listen, not only to Luna's words, but to the quiet language of hope that breathed between the lines, in the gentle rise and fall of Caleb's chest, in the subtle flicker behind his son's closed eyelids. There was a profound tenderness in these moments, a fragile trust building that required no force or urgency. Love, David realized, was not just spoken or shown through actions. Sometimes it was simply the willingness to be there without expectation, without demand. The silence became a shared rhythm, a sacred space where healing could begin quietly, almost invisibly beneath the surface. Over time, these meaningful silences stitched together a delicate tapestry of connection, resilience, and renewed faith in the possibility of recovery. It was in these still profound pauses that David rediscovered his own strength, not by trying to fix what had been broken, but by honoring the present moment with unwavering presence, a silent, powerful testament to a father's love that words could never fully capture. For weeks, the hospital room had been cloaked in a heavy stillness, every breath measured every second, stretching thin between hope and despair. But on that quiet afternoon, something shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that sent a ripple through the air. Caleb's finger twitched, a faint tentative flutter that was easy to miss, yet it carried the weight of a miracle waiting to unfold. David, sitting silently by the bedside, felt his heart seize, every muscle tensing, as his eyes locked on that single fragile sign of life. Time seemed to slow, the sterile hospital sounds fading into the background as the world narrowed to that one tiny movement, a beacon piercing through the long night of uncertainty. Luna, standing nearby, caught the change too, her breath catching as a fragile thread of hope wove itself between them. The doctors, busy with their charts and machines, might have missed it, but for David this was a language beyond words, a whisper from his son that the fight wasn't over. That finger, so small and slight, became a testament to endurance, a quiet rebellion against the silence that had filled the room for too long. It was a beginning, uncertain, fragile, yet undeniable, and it awakened something deep inside David, a rekindling of faith and determination he thought had been lost forever. In that fleeting moment, the hospital room transformed from a place of waiting into a place of possibility, where every breath held promise and every heartbeat marked a step back toward life. Caleb's subtle movement was more than physical. It was a signal, a fragile but powerful message that the story was far from finished, and that healing, slow, imperfect but real, had quietly begun. When Caleb's finger twitched, the room held its breath, but the doctors were quick to dismiss it as a simple reflex, a meaningless twitch in a body that had long been caught in the limbo between life and death. The nurses nodded, exchanging professional glances that spoke of cautious optimism tempered by years of hard experience. They labeled it a reflex, a neurological reaction without conscious thought, something to monitor but not to celebrate. Yet in the quiet corner of that sterile hospital room, Luna Morales felt something entirely different stirring within her. To her, the slight, deliberate motion was far more than an involuntary twitch. It was a sign, a fragile, precious signal that Caleb was beginning to emerge from the silence. Luna, who had spent hours sitting beside Caleb's still form, reading stories of stars and constellations into the heavy air, recognized the movement as a connection, a reaching out from the darkness, a first whisper from the boy trapped inside. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and cautious restraint. She understood the stakes. The medical world was built on proof and evidence, not feelings and intuition, but she also knew the power of presence, of being there to witness the unspoken. While the doctors charted his vitals and scanned the monitors, Luna's eyes never left Caleb's fragile hand. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. She felt the invisible thread stretching between them, an unbroken line of quiet communication that transcended words. In her mind, that twitch was a promise that life, even in its faintest flicker, still held the power to heal, to transform, to defy the odds. Luna's belief was a light in the darkness, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to hope when all else seemed lost. David sat silently beside Caleb's hospital bed, his eyes fixed on the fragile movement of his son's twitching finger. Hope was a foreign feeling, a fragile flicker he wasn't yet willing to embrace, wary of the disappointment that could follow too much expectation. He had learned through months of silent vigil that healing was not a steady march, but a series of delicate, unpredictable steps, some forward, some back, and many barely perceptible to anyone but those who truly cared. So instead of reaching for hope, David chose to watch closely, to observe every subtle sign, as if reading a secret language only he and Caleb shared. Each minute twitch, each faint pulse in his son's limb became a quiet declaration of life, stubbornly clinging on beneath the veil of unconsciousness. David's mind raced, questioning, doubting, yet longing for meaning in every small motion. Was this reflex or something more? Was his son truly beginning to emerge, or was it the cruel trick of an injured body mimicking life? He resisted the urge to speak, to call out, or to project wishes onto a boy who had been silent far too long. Instead, he let the room's stillness wash over him, feeling the weight of the moment, the slow turning of a tide he'd almost forgotten existed. With every twitch, David felt the walls of his own despair crack slightly, revealing a cautious glimmer of something deeper, an instinctual understanding that healing didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered. And in that whisper, David found a fragile thread of connection, a reason to keep sitting, keep watching, and most of all keep believing, even if only in the quietest way possible. In the dim light of the hospital room, as Luna's soft voice traced the contours of constellations and distant stars, something extraordinary happened. Caleb, his eyes still closed, but his head moving slowly, deliberately tilted toward her voice. It was subtle at first, a faint shift barely noticeable to anyone but the patient and the woman reading beside him. Luna paused, her breath-caught heart pounding quietly with hope, as she saw the unmistakable sign, a clear, intentional response breaking through the fog of his coma. The nurses, who had long resigned themselves to silence, looked up, disbelief flickering in their eyes, while David, standing quietly nearby, felt his chest tighten with a mixture of awe and cautious optimism. This was more than a twitch or reflex. It was a signal that Caleb's mind was engaging with the world again, reaching through the darkness to grasp the thread Luna's voice was offering. The tilt of his head was a fragile but undeniable connection, a breakthrough in the silence that had held them captive for so long. It was as if the universe itself had whispered back to the boy who had been lost among shadows, responding to the stars and stories Luna shared. In that moment, time seemed to slow, the room filled with a sacred stillness that spoke of hope rekindled and new beginnings. Luna's voice continued steady and patient, each word a lifeline. David watched with eyes brimming with unshed tears, feeling the heavy weight of despair begin to lift. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged with possibility. Caleb was coming back bit by bit, sound by sound, and for the first time in months his family dared to believe in the miracle of presence, the power of quiet love, and the strength found in simply being there. Luna's hands moved with quiet purpose as she began to transform Caleb's hospital room into a miniature cosmos, a universe of colors and shapes that felt like a secret invitation to a world beyond the sterile white walls and the steady beep of machines. She carefully sketched planets in crayon and colored pencil, their rings shimmering in soft hues of blue and gold, their surfaces textured with swirls and spots that hinted at mysteries waiting to be discovered. One by one, she cut out stars of various sizes from yellow construction paper, their jagged edges imperfect but radiant under the harsh hospital lights. She taped them gently to the ceiling, the walls, and even the window frames, placing them with deliberate care, as if each had a story to tell Caleb, a silent message that the vastness of space could reach even the smallest room. The moon, painted silver and dusted with glitter, hung near the bed, a constant companion in the night sky she was creating around him. She pinned constellations in the shape of Orion and Cassiopeia, where Caleb could see them, their lines drawn with fine black marker connecting the paper stars in a pattern that held meaning beyond the physical. Luna wasn't simply decorating a room, she was weaving hope into the very air surrounding Caleb with symbols of light and wonder that whispered of journeys yet to be taken and stars yet to be reached. As she worked, her voice resumed its gentle cadence, reading aloud from the book of cosmic tales she'd brought, her words floating softly across the space like a lullaby. Each planet and star seemed to respond, breathing life into the silence, creating a rhythm that matched the slow, steady beat of Caleb's heart. David watched from the doorway, hesitant to interrupt, but unable to look away. He saw the transformation not only in the room but in the boy lying there, subtle shifts in expression, flickers of recognition, the fragile beginnings of connection. Luna's presence, her patience, and the universe she crafted around Caleb were doing what medicine alone could not, rekindling a sense of wonder and the promise of return. The room, once cold and clinical, now held the warmth of a shared dream, a space where healing began not just in body, but in spirit. In this fragile constellation of paper stars and whispered stories, hope was no longer distant. It was tangible, glowing softly just within reach. The transformation of Caleb's hospital room into a miniature universe did not go unnoticed. What had begun as Luna's quiet project soon became a beacon, drawing the attention and curiosity of other children in the pediatric wing. Word spread among the patients and their families about the room adorned with glowing stars, swirling planets, and shimmering moons, a space unlike any other in the sterile hospital environment. Children who were often confined to their beds or tethered to machines found themselves magnetized by the room's gentle glow and the stories whispered within its walls. Nurses and staff, initially surprised by the unexpected charm of the decorations, began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere whenever a small group of kids gathered around the door, eyes wide with wonder and hope. The walls, once cold and clinical, now felt alive with possibility, a cosmos that invited imagination and escape from pain. Luna's presence, quiet but steady, became a comforting constant to the young visitors who came to share in the magic she'd created. Parents who had been weighed down by fear and uncertainty found themselves smiling for the first time in weeks, watching their children's faces light up as they pointed to the constellations and planets, asking questions about stars and black holes. The room became a sanctuary not only for Caleb, but for a whole community of children who needed more than medicine. They needed connection, joy, and something to believe in. The hospital staff even began to rearrange schedules so that the little visitors could come at times when the room was quiet, ensuring Luna could continue her gentle rituals without interruption. Nurses would occasionally join in reading alongside Luna, or sharing stories of their own, weaving the children's experiences together in a tapestry of shared hope and healing. The room's miniature universe was more than decoration. It was a tangible symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, light could find a way to shine. It became a place where laughter and curiosity mingled with the quiet hum of machines, where the boundaries between illness and recovery blurred in the presence of wonder. For Caleb, this universe was not just a backdrop. It was a promise, a living testament that the vastness of the cosmos and the depth of human care could come together to spark a miracle, inspiring all who entered to believe in the possibility of a new dawn. David sat quietly by Caleb's bedside, his eyes slowly adjusting to the soft glow that now filled the once sterile hospital room. What had once felt like a cold, oppressive space, dominated by monitors and medical machines, had transformed into something entirely different, a sanctuary bathed in the gentle light of stars, planets, and constellations that Luna had painstakingly drawn and placed around the room. The presence of this miniature universe seemed to dissolve the heavy weight of despair that had settled over him for so long, replacing it with a fragile but undeniable seed of hope. The walls no longer felt like barriers closing in, but rather like windows opening onto infinite possibilities. Each carefully taped planet and twinkling star whispered a quiet promise that healing was more than just physical recovery. It was also about nurturing the spirit, feeding the soul. David found himself lingering in the space longer than before, no longer feeling the urge to retreat from the world outside or drown in his silent grief. Instead, he was drawn to the room's calm energy, the subtle invitation to imagine a future beyond the long nights and unanswered prayers. He noticed how Caleb's eyes, though still heavy with sedation, seemed to follow the shapes on the ceiling with a faint spark of recognition, as if the stars themselves were guiding him back to life. For David, this shift was profound, not a sudden miracle, but a gentle unfolding of something essential, a reminder that even in the darkest places, light could be found if one was willing to look. The universe Luna had created was not just decoration. It was a metaphor for their journey, a vast expanse where healing could begin amid uncertainty. In this transformed space, David felt a deepening connection not only to his son, but also to the fragile thread of hope that tethered them both to a future still unwritten. It was a sacred place now, where silence held meaning, and presence spoke louder than words. And for the first time in months, David allowed himself to believe, not in certainty, but in the possibility that Caleb's story was far from over. One quiet night, the hospital room was cloaked in shadows, and the soft hum of machines that measured life itself. Luna sat beside Caleb's bed, a well-worn book resting gently in her hands, its pages filled with stories of distant galaxies and the mysteries of the night sky. Her voice was steady and low, weaving a gentle narrative about the last star in the Milky Way, a star that shone bravely, despite the vast darkness surrounding it. As she spoke, her words flowed like a soothing lullaby, delicate and patient, meant to cradle a soul lost between worlds. Outside the corridor was silent, the usual bustle of the hospital subdued by the late hour, but inside the room something quietly shifted. Caleb's eyelids, heavy and motionless for so long, fluttered like fragile wings against the tide of unconsciousness. Luna didn't notice at first. Her focus was on the story, on each syllable that painted pictures of light piercing through the cosmic dark. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Caleb's eyes opened. They weren't fully awake, more like the first tentative flickers of a candle in the night. But to Luna and David, who had been waiting tirelessly by his side, it was a moment charged with meaning. It was as if the star Luna described had found a way to reach into Caleb's shadowed mind, sparking a fragile connection to the world outside. Luna's voice faltered briefly, but she continued reading, encouraged by the subtle sign of life. David's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of hope and disbelief, flooding his heart. That night, under the quiet glow of the hospital lights, a profound and delicate miracle began. A single moment where darkness gave way to the faintest light, and a boy lost in silence reached back toward the life waiting patiently for him. In the stillness that followed Caleb's first fluttering open of his eyes, the room seemed to hold its breath, every heartbeat echoing the fragile hope that had just sparked to life. David sat close, leaning in with cautious anticipation, his eyes searching for any sign that this fragile awakening might be more than just a fleeting moment. Caleb's gaze drifted slowly around the room, unfocused but curious, as if he was trying to piece together the world he had been absent from for so long. Then, with a subtle movement that felt monumental in the silence, his lips parted, and a single word emerged, soft, tentative, yet charged with meaning, light. The word hung in the air, fragile as a whisper, but powerful enough to shatter the long-held silence that had enveloped his being. David's heart surged with an overwhelming mix of relief and joy, tears welling in his eyes as the sound grounded them all in the reality of this miraculous moment. Luna, sitting nearby, felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet affirmation that her patient, gentle presence had reached Caleb in a way no medicine could. The word light was more than just a sound. It was a signal of life returning, of consciousness rekindling after an endless night. It was a promise that the darkness was receding bit by bit and that Caleb's spirit was stirring back to the world. For David, Luna, and all who had waited in silent hope, that single word became a beacon, a fragile but unwavering light that would guide the difficult journey ahead, one small step at a time, toward healing and wholeness. David sat frozen, his breath caught in his chest as the word light slipped softly from Caleb's lips, a sound so delicate and profound it shattered the long, heavy silence that had cloaked their lives. Time seemed to slow the steady beeping of machines fading into the background as overwhelming emotion surged through him like a tidal wave crashing against the walls of his heart. Tears welled up, blurring his vision, but he didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, utterly speechless, caught between disbelief and a desperate hope he dared not fully embrace until now. The years of waiting, the endless nights by Caleb's bedside, the crushing weight of uncertainty, they all converged in this single miraculous moment. David's mind raced through memories of the accident, the hospital hallways, the numbing routine that had defined his existence, and the unbearable silence that had once seemed eternal. Yet here was his son breaking through the darkness with a single word, a simple beacon cutting through the void. His chest tightened with a mixture of relief and awe, the sound echoing like a sacred vow that whispered promises of healing and return. For so long, David had carried a hollow ache, a void where his son's laughter and voice should have been, and now that void began to fill not with certainty, but with fragile possibility. He dared not move, afraid that any sudden breath might shatter this delicate breakthrough, so he simply sat still, silent and utterly broken open by the weight of love and hope. In that quiet hospital room with machines softly humming and a single word lingering in the air, David's world shifted, irrevocably transformed by the gentle power of a son's first whisper of light. Luna's eyes remained steady, unblinking, as if the weight of the moment had settled quietly within her, a calmness that belied the depth of what had just unfolded. She didn't cry. There were no tears spilling down her cheeks, no tremble in her voice to betray the flood of emotions beneath the surface. Instead, she simply whispered her words, carrying the profound stillness of someone who had carried hope and patience through years of waiting. "I've been waiting for you for so long." The simplicity of her statement was like a soft thread stitching together the fractured moments of the past with the fragile promise of the present. In that room, the space between them seemed to pulse with something unspoken, an unbreakable bond forged in silence and endurance. David felt the weight of her words settle over him like a benediction, a recognition that transcended pain and spoke to a shared journey neither had chosen, but both had endured. Luna's voice was steady, neither pleading nor demanding, just an honest acknowledgement of time lost and a future reclaimed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke again, their silence filled with the gravity of that simple truth. The world outside the hospital room with its urgency and noise felt distant and irrelevant, as if all that mattered was the quiet connection blossoming between them now. David's heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for this miracle of presence, sorrow for the years they'd lost. Luna's gaze held his steady and unwavering, as if to say that this moment was only the beginning, that hope had finally found its voice in the space where darkness once lived. Her words echoed softly, a quiet promise woven into the stillness. "I've been waiting for you for so long." Just as Caleb's eyes began to open more frequently and his fingers started to twitch with intention, bringing a glimmer of hope to the sterile hospital room, Luna disappeared without a word or warning, slipping away like a quiet shadow fading into the uncertain dawn. One day she was there reading softly by his bedside, tracing constellations with gentle fingers on paper planets stuck to the walls, and the next she was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that echoed louder than any silence had before. The absence of her steady presence was like the sudden extinguishing of a small but vital light. In a dark room, Caleb's progress faltered, the fragile rhythm they'd built together seemed to wobble, and David felt a hollow ache that settled deep in his chest, heavier than any medical report or prognosis could describe. Hospital staff mentioned nothing unusual, no explanation for Luna's sudden disappearance. She was simply no longer on the schedule, no longer found in the quiet corners where she used to sit, no longer the soft voice weaving stars and galaxies into the fabric of Caleb's awakening. David searched for answers among nurses and administrators, but the walls of bureaucracy offered only cold silence or vague excuses. His heart clenched with worry, not just for Caleb's healing, which had shown new promise under Luna's patient care, but for the girl herself whose own story had become intertwined with their fragile hope. Luna had been more than a visitor or volunteer. She had become the gentle gravity pulling Caleb back from the void, a beacon of patience and light in a world that had been dark and still for far too long. Now, without her, David faced a terrifying uncertainty. The fear that the progress they'd made might unravel, and that the quiet miracle they had witnessed might slip just beyond their reach. In the empty spaces where Luna once sat, David felt the weight of loss again, but also a desperate determination to find her, to understand why she had left, and to hold on to the fragile thread of hope she had spun from silence and stars. After noticing Luna's sudden absence from the hospital, David's unease grew like a shadow creeping over the fragile light they had built together. He asked the nurses, searched through visitor logs, and even spoke with staff at the community center where Luna sometimes volunteered, but no one seemed to know where she had gone. The void she left felt vast and unsettling, as if the quiet thread holding Caleb's fragile progress was at risk of unraveling without her steady presence. Determined to understand, David began to dig deeper, navigating the complex web of bureaucracy and hidden truths that surrounded Luna's life outside the hospital walls. Through conversations with social workers and hesitant whispers among the hospital staff, he discovered a heartbreaking reality. Luna's mother had been detained by ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency. The news hit David like a blow. This was not just about a missing girl, but a family torn apart by fear and uncertainty, caught in the crosshairs of a system that threatened to erase the very people who had become his lifeline to hope. The revelation filled him with a fierce urgency to act, to find a way to protect Luna and her mother from a fate that could destroy not only their fragile family, but the fragile healing Caleb had begun. As he pieced together the fragmented details, phone calls made in secret, legal notices slipped under doors, the whispered fears of those who dared to speak, David felt a surge of responsibility that went beyond fatherhood. It was no longer just about Caleb's recovery. It was about standing up to a relentless force that sought to silence a family's voice, about fighting for the right to simply exist, to be seen and loved, despite the odds stacked against them. The stakes had risen, and David knew the path ahead would demand everything he had and more. For the first time since Caleb's accident, David felt a fire ignite within him, a fierce determination not just to watch from the sidelines, but to act, to fight for someone else with the same unwavering presence Luna had shown his son. He realized that the fragile thread Luna had woven into Caleb's recovery was now a lifeline not only for the boy, but for a young girl caught in a merciless system. David's days of silent observation were over. Driven by a newfound purpose, he began reaching out to immigration advocates, legal aid organizations, and community activists, using every connection he had built in his life before the accident. He pored over legal documents, learning unfamiliar terms and procedures, educating himself quickly to stand a chance in a battle he hadn't expected to face. Each phone call, each email sent was a step toward reclaiming the hope Luna's family desperately needed. His usual control and precision, honed in boardrooms and business deals, now channeled into navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy and heartache. But unlike before, this fight was personal, deeply human. It was about protecting the quiet girl who had given his son a voice when all seemed lost. David attended meetings, signed petitions, and even sat through tense hearings, often exhausted but never deterred. He found himself advocating fiercely in courtrooms and community centers, his voice growing stronger as he spoke up for Luna's mother, refusing to let her be swept away by an indifferent system. In doing so, David discovered a new part of himself, a protector, a warrior, for justice, someone willing to step into the unknown, not for business or profit, but for love and loyalty. Luna had saved Caleb's world with her quiet presence, and now David was determined to stand up for her, to be the steadfast guardian she never asked for but so clearly deserved. This was a fight for family, for dignity, for hope, reborn amidst the shadows of fear. David had spent so long engulfed in silence, a heavy quiet that had settled over his life like a fog after Caleb's accident, an absence not just of words but of hope, action, and purpose. Yet now that silence was breaking, replaced by something fierce and undeniable responsibility. He realized that silence, once a shield against pain, had become a prison isolating him from the very life he longed to reclaim. The stillness that had allowed him to drift aimlessly was no longer an option, not when Luna had stepped into his son's darkest moments and ignited a fragile spark of healing. The weight of that gift pressed on him, demanding more than gratitude. It called for action. So David rose from his shadowed existence and embraced the role he had long avoided, that of a protector, an advocate, and a father, who would no longer stand on the sidelines. His hands, once idle, now moved purposefully through calls, emails, and meetings, cutting through the tangled red tape that threatened to tear Luna and her family apart. Each step he took was an assertion that silence would no longer define him, that passivity was a betrayal of the fragile hope Luna had woven into Caleb's recovery. The man who had once retreated into despair now faced the world with renewed resolve, channeling pain into advocacy, fear into courage, and loss into a fierce determination to protect the vulnerable. This transformation was more than personal. It was a reclamation of dignity, a vow to stand for those who had been silenced by circumstance. As David acted, his silence gave way to a powerful presence, a voice speaking not only for Luna, but for every quiet soul fighting to be seen, heard, and saved. The stillness was gone, replaced by the relentless rhythm of responsibility and the courage to fight for what truly mattered. After weeks of relentless effort navigating a maze of legal hurdles and bureaucratic delays, David finally received the news he had been praying for. Luna's mother was granted humanitarian release. The weight of that moment pressed down on him, a mix of relief and disbelief, settling deep into his bones. He had witnessed firsthand the toll that fear and uncertainty had taken on Luna, the quiet strength she carried beneath her calm exterior, now matched by a hope that had begun to flicker in her eyes. This was more than a victory. It was a lifeline thrown into the turbulent waters of their lives, a chance to reclaim a fractured sense of safety and belonging. David knew the road ahead would not be easy. There were still countless legal battles and challenges to face, but this milestone was a beacon, a signal that perseverance and compassion could break through even the thickest walls of injustice. When he told Luna the news, he saw something shift in her posture, a lightness that had been absent for so long. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile, a fragile but powerful acknowledgement that the shadows threatening to consume her family were beginning to recede. David felt a profound sense of purpose swell inside him. This was why he had fought, why he had stepped beyond his own grief and silence to become an advocate not only for Caleb, but for the people who stood silently beside him in this fight. The release of Luna's mother was a testament to the power of connection, resilience, and the unyielding belief that no one should be invisible in the face of hardship. As he watched Luna embrace her mother for the first time in what felt like forever, David understood that hope was no longer just a whisper in the dark. It was becoming a chorus, rising louder with every act of courage and kindness they shared together. Luna had always carried her dreams quietly tucked away beneath layers of caution and survival instincts honed by years of living in the shadows. So when the letter arrived, an official notice of a scholarship to a prestigious university program, it was almost surreal. The scholarship was generous, covering tuition, books, and even living expenses, offering a future that had seemed impossible before. What struck Luna most was that the sender was anonymous, a guardian angel hidden behind the curtain of generosity. She wondered who could see her potential so clearly, who could believe in her when so many had looked past her. Meanwhile, David watched from afar with a quiet satisfaction. The decision to support Luna, made without fanfare or expectation, driven purely by a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. He knew the path ahead for Luna was still fraught with uncertainty, legal status acceptance, the pressure to succeed, but this scholarship was a lifeline, a tangible sign that she was not alone and that someone believed in her worth beyond the confines of her undocumented status. For Luna, the scholarship was more than financial aid. It was an invitation to step into the light to claim the education and opportunities she had long been denied. When David finally revealed himself as the benefactor, there was no grand announcement, just a quiet meeting where words were few, but meaning was immense. Luna's eyes brimmed with tears, not of pity, but of recognition, understanding that someone had seen her not as an invisible outsider, but as a bright star worthy of a place among the brightest minds. The scholarship became a turning point, a beacon that lit the way forward, reminding both Luna and David that sometimes the most profound impact comes from unseen hands offering support in the quietest ways. Together they faced a future filled with hope and the unspoken promise that no dream was too distant to reach. Luna accepted the scholarship with a mixture of gratitude and humility, knowing deep down that this opportunity was not just a gift to her, but a responsibility she could not take lightly. When she finally met David to thank him in person, her voice was steady but filled with quiet determination. "Thank you for believing in me," she said softly, her eyes meeting his with a seriousness that went beyond gratitude. Then after a pause, she added, "But this isn't just about me. There are so many others like me, kids, families who are still invisible, still fighting battles no one sees. If you're going to help me, you have to help them too." David listened carefully, understanding the weight behind her words. Luna wasn't just asking for charity. She was asking for justice, for a commitment to a cause much larger than any single person. She spoke of her community, the fears, the struggles, the silent hopes, and how every act of kindness could ripple out to change lives beyond their own. David felt a stirring inside him, a call to move beyond the immediate crisis, and to stand alongside those whose voices were drowned out by silence and fear. He nodded not with grand promises, but with the resolve to do whatever he could to support Luna's vision. Together they began to sketch a future where the resources and opportunities Luna received would become a starting point, not an end point, a spark to ignite change that could reach others in the shadows. Luna's courage in asking for more than herself became a catalyst, awakening in David a deeper purpose, and cementing a partnership rooted in empathy, action, and hope. Their shared commitment was no longer about survival alone, it was about building a community where no one would have to be invisible again. In that moment, David felt a profound shift within himself, a deep awakening to the true meaning of gratitude and responsibility. It wasn't just about saying thank you or feeling indebted. It was about recognizing that every gift carries with it a duty to give back, to pay forward, and to protect those who remain vulnerable. Watching Luna's unwavering resolve, he understood that gratitude was a living force, not a passive sentiment. It demanded action, courage, and a commitment that went beyond words. For the first time in years, David saw his own life reflected in the broader tapestry of community and shared humanity. The walls he had built around himself, the isolation, the fear, the silence began to crumble as he realized that true gratitude meant standing up, speaking out, and using whatever resources he had to fight for justice and dignity. He understood that responsibility was not a burden, but a privilege, an opportunity to honor those who had helped him find his way back from despair. This realization infused him with new purpose. It was no longer enough to be a witness to suffering, he had to be a catalyst for change. David's heart, once heavy with regret and helplessness, now carried a quiet strength born of hope and determination. He resolved to be more than a man who observed from the sidelines. He would be a protector, an advocate, a voice for the unseen. This was the true gift Luna had given him, not just a second chance for Caleb, but a chance to live fully with integrity, compassion, and unwavering commitment to others. And as he embraced this new path, David knew that gratitude and responsibility were forever intertwined, shaping every step he would take, from that day forward. Caleb's recovery unfolded like a quiet miracle, slow but steady each day, marked by small victories that gradually rewrote the narrative of his life. The once silent room where he had lingered between worlds now echoed with the subtle sounds of movement, soft shuffles, the careful placing of feet, the tentative balance of a body relearning itself. At first it was just a finger twitch, then a hand grasp, then a foot pressing firmly against the floor. Therapists and doctors watched in cautious hope as Caleb took his first shaky steps, supported by a steady hand and unwavering determination. Those early moments of standing and walking were fragile and filled with uncertainty, but for Caleb and David they carried the weight of triumph and renewed possibility. The hospital corridors, once sterile and heavy with sorrow, began to feel alive with promise. Caleb's eyes, once clouded by unconsciousness, now held a spark of curiosity and life, reflecting a boy eager to reclaim the world that had slipped away from him. His laughter, though tentative, became a balm to David's weary heart, a reminder that healing was more than physical. It was the rekindling of a spirit that refused to be broken. Every step Caleb took was a testament to the power of presence, patience, and love. As he grew stronger, the boundaries between the hospital and the outside world blurred, and soon walking unassisted became a symbol not just of recovery, but of hope, reborn, a quiet but powerful declaration that life, despite its fragility, could find its way back from the darkest places. After weeks of silence and stillness, the hospital room seemed to hold its breath the moment Caleb's eyes flickered open, tracing the shapes and shadows around him with hesitant awareness. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper but filled with undeniable clarity, he asked, "Where's Luna?" The name hung in the air, fragile yet insistent, as if it carried the weight of every moment he had spent, suspended between sleep and wakefulness. For David, those words were more than just the first sound to break the long silence. They were a lifeline, a connection reaching out from the depths of his son's mind toward the girl who had been the unexpected bridge back to life. Luna, the quiet presence who had sat by Caleb's bedside, reading stories of stars and galaxies, whose voice had gently pulled him from the void, she had become more than just a visitor. She was the thread weaving together the fractured pieces of Caleb's world. David's heart tightened as he realized how much his son remembered, how deeply Luna had touched him, even without speaking directly to anyone else. The question echoed a profound truth. Recovery was not just about healing the body, but about reclaiming the bonds that give life meaning. "Luna's here," David whispered, moving closer to his son. "She's right here." In that moment, hope blossomed anew, fueled by the recognition that sometimes the most unexpected people become the guides who lead us back from darkness. And Caleb's voice asking for Luna was a testament to the power of quiet, unwavering presence. The hospital room still held traces of the universe Luna had created, paper stars and planets taped carefully to the walls and ceiling, a celestial map that transformed the sterile space into a small cosmos filled with hope and quiet wonder. Each star, each constellation was a reminder of the journey Caleb had taken, not just from darkness toward light, but from silence to connection. The faded paper circles, some slightly curling at the edges, whispered stories of late afternoons spent folding and pasting, of patient voices reading softly into the night. To David, those stars were more than decoration. They were symbols of resilience, of the fragile but unyielding thread that held his son's spirit tethered to this world. As Caleb's strength grew, the room no longer felt like a place of waiting, but a sanctuary of healing where the boundaries between science and something deeper, almost sacred, blurred. David would often sit quietly, tracing the edges of those stars, with his eyes feeling a surge of gratitude for the invisible light they represented. Light that had pierced the darkness of his son's coma and illuminated a path forward. It was Luna's gift, her presence, that had quietly rewritten the meaning of recovery, reminding them both that sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine alone, but from the gentle constellations we build around those we love. Even as Caleb took tentative steps toward a new life, the paper stars lingered, silent witnesses to the fragile miracle of hope, a universe held together by small acts of care and the unspoken promise of brighter days ahead. When Luna returned to the hospital room, the air seemed to shift, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The moment she stepped through the door, Caleb's face lit up with a joy that had been absent for so long, a radiant smile that reached his eyes and made them sparkle with life. Their laughter filled the sterile space, breaking through the lingering silence that had once seemed so impenetrable. The two children, once separated by illness and uncertainty, now shared a connection that transcended words, playing teasing and sharing secrets in quiet bursts of happiness. Luna's presence was a balm, not just for Caleb's fragile body, but for the whole room, turning it into a sanctuary of hope and renewal. David watched from a distance, his heart swelling with gratitude and relief, witnessing the healing power of friendship and presence in a way no medication could replicate. The bond between Luna and Caleb was no longer just about survival. It had blossomed into something vibrant and alive, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their laughter echoed softly down the hospital corridors, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could return, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the healing strength of connection. In that room, under the soft glow of the paper, stars still hanging on the walls, two children reclaimed their joy, and a father found peace in knowing his son was not alone anymore. In that quiet hospital room filled with laughter and light, David felt something shift deep within him, a realization so profound it unsettled and uplifted him all at once. For years he had been surviving, moving through the motions of life like a ghost, haunted by loss, weighed down by silence and regret. But now, watching Caleb and Luna play, seeing the genuine joy that radiated between them, David understood that this was more than mere existence. This was truly living. It wasn't about the endless meetings he had once buried himself in, or the numbing routines he clung to in an attempt to control a world that had spun wildly out of his grasp. It was about presence, the raw, unfiltered experience of connection, of vulnerability, of hope, woven through moments shared without expectation or fear. As he sat there feeling the steady rhythm of his son's laughter, David realized that life's meaning had never been in the achievements or the status, but in these fragile, beautiful slices of time when love and healing met. For the first time, he wasn't just a man marked by loss. He was a man reborn by it. He breathed in the noise, the warmth, the life around him, and knew with certainty that this moment, simple, imperfect, alive, was what it truly meant to be alive. David was no longer merely existing in the shadow of tragedy. He was embracing the light of a second chance, fully present, fully human, fully alive. Life often teaches us its most profound lessons, not in grand, sweeping moments, but in the quiet spaces between the small acts of presence, the patient listening, the gentle gestures that say, "I'm here." David's journey shows us that survival is not enough. True living demands attention, vulnerability, and the courage to be fully present with those we love, even when it's hard. In a world that pushes us to chase success, power, and control, it's easy to forget that the deepest connections, the ones that heal and transform, are built in stillness and shared silence. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply to show up without agenda or expectation, to be a steady presence when someone else feels lost or invisible. This story reminds us that healing is a collective journey. It takes community, patience, and kindness, not just for others, but for ourselves. It encourages us to look beyond surface struggles and see the humanity in every person's quiet battles. Most importantly, it challenges us to rethink what it means to be there for someone, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. So let this be a call to action. Slow down, listen more, judge less, and be present. Whether it's a family member, a friend, or a stranger, your presence can light a path through darkness. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to leave a comment sharing your own experiences or thoughts. Save this video to return to when you need a reminder about the power of presence. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, connect, and remind us of what really matters in life. Your support helps us keep telling these stories, and together we build a community where every voice is seen and every story matters.